The air inside the Ridgefield Operations Hall was painfully still, thick with the hum of overhead fluorescence and the unspoken weight of hierarchy. Rows of uniformed men sat upright, shoulders square, eyes forward, their attention fixed on the figure at the front. General Cole Harding didn't wait for silence because it always followed him anyway. He paused in his address, then glanced sideways without even turning his head. That's when he said it loud enough to echo off the polished floor. Maybe next time Captain Lane can bring her purse to the cockpit just in case the lipstick gets dry. The room didn't erupt with laughter, but the ripple was worse. A low, knowing chuckle passed between ranks, not from humor, but compliance. Captain Emily Lane didn't blink. She stood still near the back wall, arms behind her, the brim of her hat casting a faint shadow across her brow. She didn't speak, didn't shift, didn't look down. She just absorbed the line in silence like she'd done so many times before, not because she was weak, but because silence had a longer memory than any insult ever would. Harding went on voice booming, pointing to flight formations on a projected map as if nothing had happened. But every eye in the room had caught the moment, and every glance that flicked toward Lane afterward was just a little more uncertain than before. Her stillness became a presence all its own, a quiet assertion that didn't need defense. It lasted only seconds, but the discomfort lingered. Not for her, though. For them. The men who laughed too quickly, the officers who looked away too fast, and the general who assumed silence meant surrender. She stood there like a figure carved from steel, and while the others were already thinking about their next maneuver, Emily Lane was remembering every word, every smirk, every glance. Because what they didn't know, what none of them saw, was that she wasn't just standing there. She was waiting, watching, and planning something they weren't ready for. Part 1. Introducing the main character, Captain Emily Lane. At 36, Captain Emily Lane carried herself with the kind of stillness that made people uneasy. Not because she was cold, but because she didn't waste words, didn't fill silences just to smooth things over. She had learned long ago that silence wasn't a weakness. It was a weapon. Her canvas duffel always looked too worn for someone with her credentials, and her boots were scuffed in a way that said she didn't care about polish-only function. Her uniform was regulation perfect, but never pressed for show. Her dark hair was always pulled back, with the kind of speed that suggested it was an afterthought. Emily had flown combat missions over Mosul and Kandahar, logged hours most pilots never saw, and carried wounds the report files never mentioned. She had once landed a smoking Black Hawk in a blind canyon while her co-pilot bled out beside her. She didn't tell those stories. They were hers, and she knew that in places like Ridgefield, stories from women were often mistaken for pleas. Her transfer to Ridgefield Air Base hadn't made headlines. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed noise. It was the kind of post where officers cared more about procedure than performance, the kind of place where a woman's file might read impeccable but still be ignored one line at a time. She'd arrived with 2 bags and no expectations. The quarters were clean, the skies quiet, and the walls thin. On her first day, she passed a pair of young lieutenants in the hallway who stopped talking the moment they saw her. Their nods were polite, but their eyes told a different story. The kind that said, "You don't belong." That quiet rejection came often. In the mess hall, conversations dropped when she entered. In briefings, questions weren't directed her way. She noticed it all but responded the same way every time. She took her notes, showed up early, left late, and never once corrected anyone for underestimating her. Emily didn't expect fairness. She expected to earn everything twice. Once for herself, and once more to prove it wasn't a fluke. She never asked for special treatment, and she certainly never needed rescue. That was the thing most people missed. She wasn't waiting for recognition. She was waiting for clarity. Before Ridgefield, she had spent 2 years stationed in Germany, flying under blackout protocols and training extraction teams. She missed the sound of turbines at night, the rhythm of takeoffs and landings, the click of instruments beneath her fingers. But here she was, grounded. Not because of rules, but because of assumptions. They said she was overqualified for simulation duty. They said the new protocol required her observational experience. What they didn't say was the truth. That Harding didn't want her flying. That her presence in the cockpit made his boys nervous. And so, she watched from the sidelines, clipboard in hand. eyes scanning every line of telemetry. She noted every mistimed command, every sloppy maneuver, every risk that would never be logged because the right people didn't want it written down. She recorded it all not on tape, but in memory, quietly. She'd learned that early in her career watching officers get promoted for speeches while soldiers like her were flown in to clean up their miscalculations. She didn't mind. There was something about being the one they forgot to factor in. It gave her space to move. Emily wasn't bitter. She wasn't angry. She was just ready. Not for applause or revenge, but for the moment when competence was the only thing that mattered. When silence would be the loudest voice in the room. Part 2. Setting the stage. Ridgefield Air Base. Ridgefield Air Base sat quiet against the plains, flat and functional with buildings arranged like pieces on a chessboard. The hangars were identical gray and clean, their interiors smelling of fuel metal and the weight of responsibility. Everything about the place was polished but impersonal, designed more for order than humanity. The command tower rose above the flight line, a glass eye watching everything but feeling nothing. Inside the hallways were wide and undecorated, filled with the echo of boots and clipped conversations. Even the mess hall felt sterile, where officers sat in rows, like pieces in a silent war of posture. Hierarchy was carved into the routines. Junior officers held doors longer than needed, not out of courtesy, but fear. The ranks dictated who spoke, who listened, and who mattered. And Emily, despite her record, lived outside those expectations. No one said it outright. There were no slurs, no open confrontations. But there were glances that lingered too long, introductions that skipped her name, and briefings where she was technically invited but functionally ignored. It was the kind of exclusion that operated quietly, like static in the air. General Cole Harding thrived in that environment. His reputation had been built on sharp uniforms, flawless optics, and decades of knowing who to impress. He walked with the confidence of someone used to being the center of the room, not because he earned it, but because no one dared to stand in that spot. His presence was never loud, but it commanded silence. He didn't have to raise his voice to shift a room. A glance was enough. A word delivered too casually could freeze conversation. He used protocol like armor and sarcasm like a scalpel. To Harding, Ridgefield was a proving ground, not for skill, but for obedience. He surrounded himself with loyalists, pilots who echoed his tone and mirrored his belief that experience mattered less than loyalty. And in that world, Emily was a disruption. She didn't fit the mold. She wasn't hostile, but she didn't play into the performance. She followed orders, but not out of admiration. She worked without asking for validation, which to Harding made her a threat more than an asset. Ridgefield wasn't a place built for women like her. It wasn't openly hostile, but it was quietly impenetrable. Every door opened with a delay. Every opportunity came with a question mark. She was allowed to be present, but never centered. And yet, she stayed. Not to prove anyone wrong, but because she understood something they didn't. Institutions forget names quickly, but they never forget the person who changes the outcome. Part 3. Conflict. When silence becomes resistance. Part 1 mocked in the mess hall. The mess hall was unusually quiet that morning. The clatter of trays and low murmur of conversation paused just enough to notice when Emily walked in. She moved through the line with calm precision, eyes straight ahead, not looking for a seat, just space. General Harding was already at the head table, fork in hand, flanked by his closest officers. He didn't look at her right away. He waited until she passed within earshot, then muttered just loud enough to be overheard. Thought this was an Air Force base, not a beauty pageant. A few chuckles broke through the silence, awkward and uneven. No one looked at her directly. They looked at each other, then back at their trays, pretending it hadn't happened. Emily didn't slow down. She found an empty seat, sat down, and began to eat. The tension lingered like steam rising off weak coffee. Harding wasn't finished. He leaned back slightly, raising his voice just enough to carry. Maybe we should put pink stripes on the runway. That way she can feel more at home. This time the laughter was louder, more confident. It wasn't about the joke. It was about permission. If the general said it, then it must be fine. Emily didn't respond. Her fork moved steadily, eyes still on her plate. Her posture didn't shift. Her expression stayed exactly the same. She wasn't ignoring him. She was refusing to react. That stillness unsettled people more than any retort ever could. It said everything without offering them a reason to fight back. It made them notice her without giving them anything to dismiss. The table across from her cleared out sooner than usual. Officers avoided eye contact as they stood. The ones who had laughed were the first to leave. No one wanted to stay in the afterglow of humiliation. Harding moved on with his meal satisfied, but there was something in his silence now, a hesitation too small to notice unless you were looking for it. Emily was. She felt it, not because she needed it, but because that pause meant he had seen it too. She wasn't flustered. She wasn't small. She hadn't flinched, and that made her dangerous in a way he didn't yet understand. Subpart 2. Sideline Protocols. By the third week, Emily's name was no longer on the flight rotation. Her spot in the simulation chamber had been reassigned, her hours shifted to desk duty. The official explanation was protocol oversight, a task usually reserved for new arrivals or officers recovering from injury. Her new workspace overlooked the main hangar, a small glass cubicle with a clipboard, a checklist, and nothing that resembled action. She never protested the change. She took the new assignment the same way she'd taken every insult, quietly and without reaction. Every day she sat and logged equipment calibrations, fuel usage reports, and system sync times. It was thankless work ignored by command and overlooked by those in the field, but it gave her something the others didn't have: perspective. She studied the simulation logs line by line, watched playback footage of practice flights with the kind of scrutiny that made others uncomfortable. Her pen rarely moved, but her mind didn't stop. She saw gaps in timing, flaws in formation, sloppy entries that Harding signed off without question. The more she watched, the more obvious the risks became. Small mistakes buried under the confidence of his inner circle, blind spots masked by routine, patterns that should have been corrected long ago but weren't because no one challenged the chain of command. Emily kept her findings to herself, not out of fear, out of strategy. She knew how the system worked. Speaking up without invitation only made you easier to dismiss. So she waited, building a mental map of every inconsistency, every oversight, every risk Harding refused to acknowledge. She was no longer flying, but in a way she had never been more in control. She saw what others missed. She noticed what they overlooked. And while the squadron practiced under Harding's orders, Emily was preparing for something else entirely. Silence was never about passivity. For her, it was attention sharpened to a fine edge. It was the discipline to observe without being seen. And in that stillness, she wasn't fading. She was preparing to act. Part 4. Internal Strength. The Plan Within. Subpart 1. Hidden Test. It was almost midnight when Emily found the file. She had stayed late again reviewing the next day's simulation logs in the control tower. The system stuttered for a moment, then opened a subdirectory labeled Priority Alpha 0. At first it looked like a duplicate, but then she saw the code, a hidden decision tree buried deep in the program set to trigger an emergency mid-mission. It wasn't part of Harding's formation brief. It wasn't even listed on his timeline. The Pentagon had embedded a stress test into the scenario, a critical systems failure unexpected and catastrophic, the kind of variable that exposed leadership gaps and forced real-time adaptation. Emily leaned back in her chair, the glow from the monitor casting sharp lines across her face. She scanned the sequence again, heart steady. If the team stayed on Harding's current plan, they'd fly straight into failure. She didn't move for a long time. Her hands rested on the console, fingers still. The protocol gave her no obligation to intervene, and Harding hadn't reviewed the file, hadn't prepared the team, hadn't even checked for updates since the briefing ended. She could warn him, but she didn't. Not out of spite, because this was more than ego. This was a test of judgment, and his had already failed. She remembered the arrogance, the silence that followed every insult, every dismissal. He had made his position clear. Now it was time for the system to answer. Emily closed the file and logged out. The lights in the hangar below were still on, but no one was moving. She looked down through the glass, watched the quiet planes waiting on the tarmac. They were ready. The question was whether their leader was. She stood slowly and picked up her clipboard. No one would know what she'd seen. Not yet. But in the morning, everything would change. Subpart 2. The Recorder. The room was full, every seat taken, the squadron packed shoulder to shoulder beneath the harsh lights of the operations hall. General Harding stood at the front, white gloves in hand, sunglasses still on despite the hour. His voice filled the space with the same confidence he wore like a second uniform. Emily stayed near the back, clipboard at her side. Not acknowledged, not needed. As Harding moved through his slides, reciting stats and tactics, she stepped once to the side, her hand brushing against the edge of the internal diagnostic panel. The device she placed was small, no larger than a thumb drive, standard issue, and perfectly legal. She didn't activate it yet. She didn't need to. Not until the moment came. Harding turned, slightly gestured in her direction, and began again, his tone slipping into mockery dressed as humor. The room responded the way it always did, with nervous laughter and stolen glances. But this time Emily reached into her jacket pocket and pressed the switch. 6 seconds of recording. Just enough. Then she let it rest. The meeting moved on. Harding wrapped up with more theater than strategy. Officers stood to leave, some with quiet relief, others still smirking. Emily didn't join them. She slipped out a side door and walked straight to the tower. The air was still, the hallway silent except for her boots against the concrete. She climbed the stairs slowly, no rush in her pace. When she reached the top deck, she stepped into the control room and shut the door behind her. Screens lined the walls, glowing blue, casting their light over the room like early dawn. She sat at the console and pulled up the flight order. One more review, one more pass. Her eyes moved from line to line, not searching, just confirming what she already knew. The failure was coming, not because the system was rigged, but because Harding had built his strategy on assumptions, not readiness. Emily leaned back slightly, letting her eyes drift to the tarmac below. 4 jets waited, lined up in silence. She could already see how it would unfold, not in detail but in rhythm. She had done her part. Not loudly, not with confrontation, just enough to let the truth speak when the moment came. And when it did, it would be his voice that echoed, not hers. Part 5. The Turning Point. Fire in the Sky. Subpart 1. Simulation Chaos. The launch was flawless. 4 jets surged into the simulated sky with perfect formation, their virtual engines roaring in unison. Inside the control tower, every monitor showed smooth telemetry angles, holding steady spacing locked. Harding stood near the center console, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the main screen. Behind the mirrored glass, Pentagon observers watched without expression. Emily stood off to the side, hands behind her back, eyes locked on the live feed. At 6:34, the first warning appeared. A flicker on Donnelly's radar, too quick for a confirmation. He reported a thermal echo, something not matching any projected path. Harding didn't hesitate. Ignore it. Stay in formation. Emily's jaw tensed. On her secondary screen, the blip appeared again. Not a glitch. A hidden variable, just like the Alpha Zero file had outlined. A rogue signal simulating an enemy craft in blackout mode. Seconds later, Vega's voice cracked through the comms. He couldn't locate Hart. His vector was off. Freeman added he saw a deviation but couldn't track the correction. The team started unraveling in real time. Telemetry drifted. Wing spacing broke. Hart veered left, possibly reacting to the ghost target. Donnelly tried to adjust, but his timing lagged. Vega slowed to regroup, causing Freeman to overcorrect. Harding snapped into the radio voice, rising. Maintain position. Push through. But the formation was no longer holding. The algorithm escalated the scenario. The system triggered a new alert. Civilian distress beacon. Unregistered aircraft in the same altitude corridor. Vega tried to warn him. They were on a direct intercept. Harding repeated his order. Stay the course. Do not adjust. His voice didn't just command, it dismissed. Emily's eyes scanned the screens. Hart collided with the civilian target. A flat tone rang out. Simulation failed. Pilot deceased. The room went still. Harding slammed the console with his palm. But the simulation wasn't over. Phase 2 began automatically. A recovery scenario. An injured pilot. A hostile incursion. Leadership response now under real-time review. The pilots were disoriented. Command links frayed. No new orders. The mission had lost structure. Harding froze. Not visibly. Just long enough. Emily saw it in the timing. The pause that followed pressure. The look in his eyes. Not control. Confusion. Then something new flashed on her console. Manual override requested. Priority 7. The system was asking for her. She was the only one cleared. The room didn't know it yet, but the test wasn't just running. It was judging, not just skill, but leadership. And Harding had failed. Emily knew what came next, and she was ready. Subpart 2. She takes control. Emily moved without hesitation. Her hand reached the emergency control lever, smooth and steady, pulling it down in one motion. The console lights shifted and her interface came to life. She didn't look at Harding. She didn't explain. She locked eyes on the screens, assessing in seconds what others had spent hours missing. Vega was off position, drifting into open threat range. Freeman's intercept was misaligned, wasting fuel and compromising cover. Emily rerouted them both in a breath. She gave Vega a hard flank to hold wide and safe. Freeman was reassigned to cover arc, staggered for tactical shield. Then she recalculated the evac path for the injured pilot and deployed drone assist. Her fingers danced across the keys, each movement exact. Her voice never entered the room. She didn't need the mic. She worked through the system itself. The simulation responded immediately. Chaos steadied. The formation pulled tight. The threat was neutralized. The civilian craft redirected. Within 5 minutes, the scenario was no longer failing. It was stable. Then it was clean. Then it was complete. No one in the room spoke. Not the officers behind the glass. Not Harding. The only sound was the soft tone of system success. Emily stepped back from the console. The override disengaged. Her hands dropped to her sides. She didn't smile. She didn't ask for recognition. She just stood there, still as ever, in a room that finally saw her clearly. The power hadn't come from yelling. It hadn't come from rank. It had come from calm, from knowing, from the silence she never needed to fill. And now every eye in that tower knew. She wasn't just capable. She was essential. And she had done it without a single word. The debrief room felt colder than usual. The walls were bare, the screen at the front looping the Pentagon insignia in low resolution. A fresh pot of coffee sat untouched in the corner, steam rising without purpose. Harding stood at the head of the table, shoulders set, eyes hard. His arms were crossed, posture stiff, like someone ready for a challenge he hadn't fully prepared for. Emily stood quietly behind the table. Not seated, not acknowledged. Colonel Wren, the lead Pentagon evaluator, leaned back in his chair with his hands folded. He began without ceremony. The simulation failed. The squadron leader failed to respond appropriately to an evolving threat scenario. He let the words hang, then continued. At Aero 639, a Priority 7 override was executed. Mission success was re-established by an officer not in the original command chain. Harding didn't flinch. With respect, sir, the override was unauthorized. Captain Lane had no standing to take command. He didn't raise his voice. He made it sound procedural, dismissive. The civilian analyst at the far end of the table spoke next. Emergency protocol grants override to the highest qualified active officer when command integrity collapses. He paused, then added quietly, "That's what happened." Harding's jaw tightened. He tried to respond, to redirect. He said the override had been unnecessary, that it was premature, that the formation was stabilizing. But no one agreed. No one nodded. The silence that followed was the kind that came with decisions already made. Emily hadn't spoken. She hadn't moved. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small black drive. She stepped forward and placed it beside the colonel's tablet. Her voice was calm. Pre-flight briefing. 3 days ago. Harding's eyes narrowed. His body tensed like he'd realized the misstep too late. The colonel plugged in the drive. The screen flickered. The audio began. And the room went still. The room was silent as the audio began. Harding's voice filled the space, crisp and unmistakable. It started as sarcasm, then shifted into something colder. He mocked Emily's presence, reduced her to a punchline, belittled her skills without hesitation. Each word echoed louder than the last, not because of volume, but because of what they revealed. The laughter that followed in the recording didn't sound like camaraderie anymore. It sounded like guilt. No one looked at Harding. They didn't need to. His own voice had stripped him bare. The tone, the arrogance, the deliberate sting in each sentence left nothing to interpretation. Emily didn't move. She didn't glance around. Her hands stayed behind her back. Her shoulders relaxed as if she had known all along this moment would come. When the recording ended, no one spoke. The silence stretched, not awkward, but final, like a verdict had already been delivered without a word. Harding's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. He looked at the colonel, then the civilian analyst, then at Emily. There was no rescue in any of those eyes. Colonel Wren tapped his pen against the table once, then closed the file in front of him. "We'll be updating the leadership review." His voice was calm, not angry, just done. Harding didn't argue. He didn't defend. For the first time, he looked small in his own uniform. Power had left the room, and it had gone with Emily. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply turned back to her place along the wall and stood at ease. Her victory didn't need applause. It was written in silence. And now everyone understood why she had never raised her voice. She had never needed to.